Is the expiry date pressure that Korean women face something unique to South Korea? Or is this happening to women across Asia and maybe far beyond that? Because when you start looking at the evidence, it becomes very clear very quickly that while South Korea has some specific and particularly intense cultural features around this issue, the core experience of being told your value is tied to getting married before a certain age is not uniquely Korean at all. Today we are going to look at how this plays out across different Asian countries, what they have in common, where they differ, and what that tells us about where this pressure actually comes from. Let's start with Japan, because it is probably the most well-known parallel. Japan has its own version of age-based marriage pressure, and it has been around for a long time. One of the most infamous expressions of this came from a phrase that emerged in the 1980s and became widely known, the idea that an unmarried woman over 25 was like a Christmas cake, desirable before the 25th, but nobody wants it after. The phrase eventually fell out of fashion, partly because it became too embarrassing to say out loud in a more educated society. But the underlying attitude did not disappear with the phrase. Japanese women still report significant social and family pressure to marry before their late 20s, and women who remain single into their 30s often describe the same experience Korean women describe: the questions, the comments, the sense of quiet judgment from the people around them. China has a term for unmarried women past a certain age that has become unfortunately widespread: 剩女, which is often translated as leftover women. The term refers specifically to educated, professionally successful women who have not married by their late 20s. Think about that framing for a moment. A woman who has invested in her own education and career, who, by any reasonable measure, should be considered accomplished, gets labeled leftover because she has not also managed to acquire a husband on the approved timeline. The term has been officially criticized and even discouraged by some Chinese media organizations, but it remains in common use, and the attitude behind it remains common even among people who would not use the word itself. In many parts of Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia, similar dynamics exist, though the specific ages and cultural details vary. In many of these contexts, a woman in her late 20s who is not yet married is already fielding pointed questions from relatives. Family gatherings become spaces where her relationship status is publicly discussed and evaluated. The expectation of marriage is closely tied to cultural and religious frameworks that define female adulthood primarily in terms of becoming a wife and mother, with personal and professional achievement treated as secondary, or as something that can only be fully celebrated once the marriage box has been checked. India deserves its own mention because the situation there is both widespread and particularly visible. Arranged marriage remains common across much of India, and with it comes an enormous infrastructure of family pressure, social expectation, and in some communities genuine social consequence for women who remain unmarried past a culturally defined age. The specific age varies significantly by region, religion, and social class, but the underlying dynamic is similar. A woman's marriageability is treated as a time-limited asset, one that needs to be deployed before it depreciates. So, what do all of these contexts have in common? A few things stand out. First, in every one of these societies, the age-based pressure falls far more heavily on women than on men. Men face their own expectations around marriage and career, but the specific framing of their worth as something that expires with age is largely absent. A 38-year-old unmarried man is rarely described as leftover, expired, or past his best. A 38-year-old unmarried woman, across most of these cultural contexts, very often is. Second, the pressure intensifies in proportion to how much women have gained access to education and economic independence. This sounds counterintuitive at first. You might expect that as women become more educated and financially capable, the pressure would ease. In some ways it does, over generations. But in the short term, women who are educated enough to pursue professional careers but still embedded in traditional family and social expectations often find themselves caught in a painful contradiction, successful by one measure, failing by another. That contradiction is where a lot of the pressure and the pain actually lives. Third, these pressures are not natural or inevitable. They are cultural and culture changes. Younger generations across Asia are pushing back against these expectations in various ways, through social media conversation, through movements like Furby in Korea, through declining marriage and birth rates that function as a collective, if silent, rejection of terms that do not feel acceptable. The pushback is uneven and incomplete and faces enormous resistance from older generations and traditional institutions. But it is real, and it is growing. What the existence of this pressure across so many different cultural contexts ultimately tells us is this: It is not about Korea specifically, or Japan specifically, or China specifically. It is about what happens in any society that has historically organized itself around controlling women's choices, and what happens when the women in that society start deciding, in increasing numbers, that they are done being controlled. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe for Japanese and Korean language learning content, fun ESL class stories, sometimes even the toxic ones, plus videos about pets, plants, and anything interesting I discover in my daily life.